Um, Good morning, evening, afternoon, everybody. I'm going to keep my voice somewhat down. I have four people asleep in the household here, I hope. The title is the same as before, How Liberating is Liberation Technology. So I guess I come to this conference, this colloquium, from a group, a lab, Soda Laboratories in Monash University, and we focus particularly on questions of political economy, but with an applied approach. So with reference to this morning's fascinating talks, I am someone who creates technology. We measure the implications and extent of technology. There's all sorts of ways that we can leverage recent technologies and for both measuring and understanding the world around us, but also for creating hopefully things that are useful in the world. But as we do that, at least our lab is very concerned with the things that have been raised this morning, and particularly to Oliver's questions before about the algorithmic bureaucracy. We have quite a large research theme which concerns itself with what we call the digital state. So what I'm going to try and do for you today is bring, I guess, from an applied political economist's perspective, some experiences of what has been called, or was called by Larry Diamond in 2010, liberation technology. So I've structured this around the promise, the experience, and the rebellion. And I hope if there's time at the end, I'll be able to speak briefly about some of the things we're doing in our lab, but one of them that I hope I will get at least is to talk about the Monash IP Observatory, which I've put in the rebellion section. Okay. So with that, let me continue. So the promise. Well, let me take you back to 2010, a decade ago. Larry Diamond wrote an influential paper in the Journal of Democracy called Liberation Technology. And I've taken today's talk structured around that to consider what he meant by that and then how our experience has been. So liberation technology in the context of modern political economy and the way that technology might be applied, as he says, is any form of information and communication technology, ICT, that can expand political, social, and economic freedom. In the contemporary era, it means essentially the modern interrelated forms of digital ICT, the computer, the internet, the mobile phone, and countless innovative applications for them, including, quote unquote, new social media, such as Facebook and Twitter. He goes on the paper to kind of outline three major areas where liberation technology had already shown promise and could potentially have even greater implications for the passage of freedoms, political, social, and economic in the future. In sense of the first, the public sphere, he saw the opportunity for the liberation technology to actually open up the public sphere in many countries for whom activists had no political voice previously. Whereas with the opportunities afforded by the internet, whether it be through cafes and chat rooms, whether it be through their own technology at home, whether it be through their own mobile devices, they could, for the first time, begin to have conversations that were able to have a political nature and have a voice and start creating something of a public discourse around the future of their society and their communities. He notes that opens the paper, in fact, with a case in China where uproar concerning the treatment of some individuals became, at that time, a catalyst for change in some of the more repressive Chinese laws. If we roll that tape forward, of course, China in recent times has certainly taken advantage of the same technology to roll back many freedoms, particularly for some groups. Transparency, another. So the opportunity here that liberation technology would afford citizens to be able to find and keep the activities of their political leadership, and also keep them accountable and publish what might be happening. We see a lot of that recently around satellite technology, investigative journalism, and so on, and academics who are using all sorts of technology to try and understand what governments, whether it's through algorithmic bureaucracy or the digital state, are trying to do. And of course, mobilization. So most people think of the Arab Spring, the revolutions that have seemed to be powered by, most recently in Hong Kong over the last couple of years, seem to be powered by the use of mobile phone technology for people to be able to mobilize, evade policing, and so on. he's looking ahead and thinking there's many opportunities here. But I'll finish Diamond with one very important quote. In the end, he notes, technology is merely a tool, open to both noble and nefarious purposes, something we've seen already both days in this colloquium. Just as radio and TV could be vehicles of information, pluralism and rational debate, so they could also be commandeered by totalitarian regimes for fanatical mobilization and total state control. Authoritarian states could commandeer digital ICT to a similar effect. Yet to the extent that innovative citizens can improve and better use these tools, they can bring authoritarianism down, as in several cases they have. Now, already in this quote, you get this kind of contest between the noble and the nefarious. And that's going to become important, particularly towards the end, where I want to speak to some recent political economic theorising around this, and particularly the strength of the state versus the society in this regard. What I want to do now is a quick flight, 6 postcards, if you like, from empirical political economy. I know this differs somewhat from the papers presented already in the colloquium, but I took Chris and Oliver's openness to the idea of having a multidisciplinary approach, and I hope that this gives particularly the conversations here an opportunity to learn from, be reminded by, and to understand what might be happening in other fields, particularly with regards to the measurement and empirical activities of trying to understand actually some of the consequences of liberation technology, the internet and so on in our world. So 6 postcards, I'm going to fly through these. So postcard number 1. This paper by Weidman and others in Science in 2016 sought to try and measure where the internet has been provided to citizens with a specific focus on ethnic groups. And what they did is they tried to key, if you like, the active internet space, and there's technical ways that they get to that, for where the internet is available to people, and they tried to connect it to specific ethnic groups who were either part of the executive power branch of the country or excluded from the executive power branch of the country. They used the ethnic power relations, the EPR list, to do this. They did this for all locations the internet was currently there, and they did this over a period of years. And what they find is that actually the provision of the internet is ethnically biased. It's biased in the way that the incumbent or the existing political exclusion or inclusion layout. Now, you might think that that's non-controversial, but that's incredibly important. If the internet is going to be one of the major engine rooms of transparency, of mobilisation and liberation, then already at kind of before you take your first step on that journey, if you already have bias in its availability, that's a real concern. They write, our findings underline one of the central impediments to liberation technology, which is that governments still play a key role in the allocation of the internet and can, intentionally or not, sabotage its liberating effects. I'll come back to this in other means in a moment. Diamond, remember, notes the overriding challenge for the digital world remains freedom of access. And this is actually just, if you like, the plumbing of the internet. There's a whole other branch of literature that looks to shutdowns of particular websites, particular services, particular platforms to communicate and so on. I'm not going to speak to them, but just even getting the internet has already a flavour of political and ethnic and political activism bias in it. And just to give you an idea of the measure here, so the key finding, this measure implies that all factors being equal, an included group, so an ethnicity with some executive power, with an average level of internet penetration for its country, would receive only 60%, so a 40% reduction of that level if it found itself as an excluded group. These are careful, applied economists who have taken into account many other factors and so on, and they have still found a substantial effect of this excluded-included effect when it comes to the availability of the internet. Postcard 2. So suppose you've got the internet and you're considering voting. What are you going to do? Well, we're humans after all, and the internet isn't just about giving us information about a political class. It also helps us to be entertained, to use our time, to follow hobbies and all sorts of things. In Germany, this paper exploited the fact that some municipalities found themselves on the outer rim, excluded, if you like, from the existing, or distance to the existing copper infrastructure that was often the bedrock for how the internet is rolled out. So there's these what are called main distribution frames, MDFs, and the authors were able to geolocate where they all were. They looked in East and West Germany, and they drew a border around them to find where the internet, if it was rolled out as DSL broadband on these copper wires, would get to. And they looked for any municipalities which were, in their language, unlucky, which is basically economists speak for trying to find a treatment versus a control group, who would be outside of these and therefore less likely to get access to DSL. This is a fate of geography, if you like, and to some extent the previous rollout of the previous technology. And they exploited this fact to look at the impact of having the internet or not on the likelihood to vote. What they found is that without doubt, the internet has led to a significant reduction in the cost of acquiring information. But at the same time, it also provides new entertainment opportunities that might compete for consumers' time. And they discover that via having access to the internet in these kind of borderland moments, these treatment areas that have got this unlucky assorting versus the ones that are able to be included in the internet, they find actually that there is a decline in the voter turnout. And it seems to be relatively strong. So relating this decrease to the initial turnout of 76.1% in the pre-internet period, this implies this having a lack of having the internet and therefore perhaps being involved in entertainment, etc., a negative persuasion rate, that is to go and vote, of around 10.9%. So that's actually, if your voter turnout was sort of 75%, then it would go down to 65%. That's a substantial decline. And it shows you that the internet brings positives and negatives when it comes to political activism. And this is something that is not a new result. This is just confirming actually that has come from before. Something that I think has been a theme of this morning is we have new technology, but we have old struggles and themes which are now being seen through the guise of the new technology. If you're interested in this, Genskar has a seminal paper in 2006 on the role of TV and voter turnout during 1940 and 70, and finds a similar sort of crowding out mechanism at play where this new entertainment medium provides an opportunity to not vote. In this case, that seems to be happening again to a large extent. Now, you could say it's at the margin, but it's an important effect. The third, this is from our lab. Klaus is one of my former students. He studied very carefully the role of the internet, and particularly the government's slowing down of the internet in Russia in the 2002 presidential election campaign. We actually looked for the same effects in the most recent election campaign, but Putin already had quite a few tools at hand, and it seems like didn't take up the option to slow the internet. What we found is evidence of slowing the internet, but in particular, again, using careful empirical analysis, slowing it down in places which had been in opposition to the government before. And this had about a 3% depressive effect on the vote. And the way you can identify this, and we verified our approach, is by looking at, for example, in Iran, this is traces here showing when the internet is slow. These are kind of difference events. So a negative event means a slowing, a positive event means a speeding up. And we're able to find that these occur very much with documented cases of the internet being slowed down in Iran. Iran is peculiar in that the information minister usually announces when they're changing the circumstances for the internet for their people. Most other countries try to keep it quiet, but he often stands up and says, yes, we've slowed down the internet, or we've stopped it here, here, and here. Very good for verification of your analysis tools. So this is interesting to us because rather than stopping the internet completely or making websites be blocked, slowing the internet down is something that is a very sneaky governmental technique. And we're seeing it more and more. The reason it's sneaky is because it's hard to get that kind of hard evidence to have a journalist and say, oh, look, my internet's not working. The page still loads, it's just really slow. But what it does is has a devastating impact on the accumulation of voice and video, and then the pushing it up into the cloud-based deployment services so others can see it. And this depresses the ability for citizens to play their part in the transparency and accountability agenda of most progressive movements. And this is why I believe it's very sneaky but widely used. And slowing the internet is something I think we're going to see more of. And in this case, we found evidence that it had a 3% depressive effect on the vote. So the vote for the incumbent, that is for Putin's party, increased by 3% relative in places where the internet had been slowed down. So it seems like this was having a real impact on the vote outcomes in the election. Now, whether that was going to be material or not is a different question, but this was a technique being used by the government. Now, let me fly through the last 3 postcards. These are all to do with social media and some of the unintended consequences that have been discovered through the empirical political economy literature. The first is a beautiful study. This is over here, Bale et al., who thought, what if we got a whole bunch of Liberals or Democrats or Republicans to be exposed to news from across the fence? So we're all very concerned about polarisation and the polarising of political views by social media. And they thought, why don't we try and see if there's a way of getting around this by exposing people to opposing views? And they concluded that whereas they get individuals to sign up to their study, they follow a bot which actually just distributes information at a not very high rate from across the fence to them. And they find that surprisingly, although Democrats didn't have a huge impact by seeing Republican posts, the Republicans, when they were exposed to Democrat or Liberal posts, they actually were, by contrast, as I say, exhibited substantially more conservative views post-treatment. So there's a backfire effect. They became kind of more hardened into their stance, their conservative stance, by being exposed to slightly more liberal information. Now, maybe you think that's expected, but it kind of is a bit depressing in the sense that one potential way that people have talked about, I mean, The Guardian, for example, I noted for a time had a section called Burst Your Bubble, which was all about trying to bring reports and opinion and news from across the divide that their readership would be unlikely to be exposed to. But this paper would suggest, you're playing with fire there, because you might actually get a hardening on each side if you do that. And here's some empirical evidence. Second, we've talked a lot today and last night about the question of the self and algorithms and who's really to blame, or where is the dividing line between me and the algorithm. Many people have blamed, if you like, algorithmic news for the reason why, or algorithmic sorting or algorithmic ranking for the reasons why we are in the mess we are with social media. This paper goes and has a look at that and actually looks at the sharing of information. And they find that the Facebook algorithmically shares obviously lots of news. But if you look at this diagram above, this is conservative and liberals, the blue and the red line. If you focus on the blue line for a moment, this is the amount of news that is possible for someone to see, randomly shown. Then this is the potential of that news that's then been shared by someone in their network. Then it's what has been shown to them, exposed to them by the algorithm, and then what it is the user has actually selected. And what they show is that if you like, the sorting that happens, the filtering of the news channels is far more substantial by human agents, that is by their friends, their network friends, and then by themselves, than it is by the algorithm. The algorithm had a small impact on what they saw, but it was a small impact compared to the substantial impact that their friends had when it came. So at the end, unfortunately, although we could argue a lot about the algorithm and trying to optimize it, at the end of the day, it still seems from this evidence that it's actually our friendship networks, which are in an algorithmic environment, still having the biggest impact on the kind of news we're exposed to. And of course, there's the issue that we know, cognitive biases and so on. We will select news that satisfies our own beliefs and so on, and we would prefer not to see things which are away from them. And so we do this selection ourselves. And you can see the effect for conservatives is actually quite strong, this last leg, if you like, of exposure. Okay, and I'll skip my last point there about fake news, because I'd like to talk about this in the interest of time. So recently, Acemoglu and others have put forward a really compelling economic and political economic theory. The idea is that we've talked a lot about the society and the state, and we've talked about this kind of contest. We'll actually do a model of that, and they try to understand between the two, what kind of outcomes can you end up with. And in their model, they have the state society contesting, and they're investing in their technology around that. And what they find is that there is actually three types of equilibrium. There's an equilibrium where you can end up with a strong state and a weak society, or a strong society and a weak state. But there's a third way where you can end up with a strong state and a strong society. And this they call the inclusive state. And it's where actually you get a co-investment. Both sides are actually getting stronger and stronger in their ability to command, if you like, algorithmic and other technologies around the public space and the interaction between them. And there's technical reasons for how this comes about in their theorizing, but it actually, once you've attained that, if you're able to, then you actually have incentives to continue doing that. And what it suggests is possibly a pathway out. We talk a lot about controlling the state, or about, its worse effects and so on, its missteps. We talk probably less about strengthening society with respect to its abilities and capabilities to have control of its own technology, but also to have stores of technology in public space, whether it's in universities, whether it's in news houses, whether it's in activist centres and so on, to actually build up a strong counter, if you like. And the theorising here suggests that that's actually the best way out for everyone, to actually have strong in both. So to not unduly clamp down on the state, but actually to have a strong society which is able to provide that kind of check and balance at the same time as having a strong state, because that's actually going to be a more efficient and better outcome for providing the kind of common goods that we look to the state to provide. I would have talked more about the Monash IP Observatory, but we're doing something in this realm. There are many people doing it as well. We make lots and lots of observations of the internet all around the world. We've worked on the Hong Kong protests, for example. We've looked at different countries at times of political and natural disasters and political tension, and we're trying to make that transparent for everyone to try and learn from it. Chris, I'll finish there, and we can go to questions.